Senses. Our life situation is one that is constantly ruled by the fundamental ignorance we call avidya. Avidya is a deep-rooted lack of true understanding which is so all-encompassing that it deceives the mind into believing that its perceptions are always valid. Due to this ignorance, we believe we know what our senses tell us, when, really speaking, we don't. Our understanding is hampered by a veil of ignorance that prevents us from seeing the true nature of things. This state of delusion makes us believe that there is nothing more to the universe than what our senses can perceive, nothing beyond the physical world we live in. In truth, there is a great deal more. Due to ignorance of the truth, the mind's attention is drawn to perceptions based in the external world. In focusing out in the direction that the senses lead, the mind becomes attached to sensory experience, and in the process builds up so many attachments in the outside world that it becomes completely entangled in worldly ways. It becomes so trapped in its own delusion that it can't see anything else. People easily get caught up in their desire for worldly experiences that come in through the sense doors. When that happens, there is no hope of reaching true happiness unless they can learn to overcome the wanting that pervades their minds. Only when wanting is subdued can attachments be overcome. Once attachments drop away, there is nothing to stop the mind from going in the direction that leads to freedom from suffering. The question is, how can we subdue our craving for sense experience? The mind is constantly confronted with sense objects that contact it in the form of sights, sounds, odors, flavors, and touches. That contact causes the mind to whirl around these objects all the time, chasing after sense gratification. So, what are the senses, and how do they work, and why do we give them so much credence? The story of the senses goes something like this. Our senses display information related to the world around us, which the mind receives and interprets in its own fashion. In other words, impressions that come in through the senses are subject to individual interpretation. Our experiences of sights, sounds, odors, flavors, and tactile sensations are based on the mind's interpretations of incoming sense data. We could say that everything is filtered through the black box of the mind. This means that everything we know via our senses is filtered through the mind, which recognizes and interprets all that data in its own particular way. Our interpretations of the incoming sense data are what we know. We don't actually know the reality of the things we perceive out there. We have our way of interpreting them, and that's as far as our understanding goes. We know the information that is stored in the black box, but we don't know the true nature of what's on the other side of the black box. Because we have to use the black box as an intermediary to access the world, we don't know what the truth of things out there really is. Everything that reaches us has already been filtered through the black box of the mind. Because of that, we can never directly access our external environment in an unfiltered way. The mind's interpretation of incoming sense data is all we truly know. When we reflect on that truth, we realize that the world is a very mysterious place. It's not quite what we think it is. People assume the world functions in a certain manner because they have learned which effects come from which causes. Seeing something happen there, they notice certain results appear here. Having worked out a theory to explain why that occurs, they then calculate that if they do this, they should get that. Because it seems to work most of the time, they feel confident that their theory is correct. But that isn't necessarily the case. All they know is that by applying that theory, they can get certain results from certain causes. Because the hypothesis appears to be reliable, people feel that it must always be correct. In fact, it's only correct within the scope of the method that was followed. Because people nowadays have faith in modern scientific explanations, they are convinced they know how the world works. One of the fundamental assumptions in science is that the senses tell us real things, that our senses give us a true representation of what we perceive. But in fact, it is not possible to comprehend the world outside, because our senses have no means of contacting it directly. After all, how do we know the world outside? We know it through seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, and touching, all of which are experienced internally. We assume that physical matter is made up of atoms because that theory seems to work well. But even then, we don't really know for sure what that means. The whole of science is based on the scientist's interpretation of experience. Scientists are quite successful at working things out according to cause and effect relationships. But, truly speaking, all the scientists can say is that when they do something, it works. They don't know exactly why. They fail to take into account that everything we know happens inside us, that the whole of it depends on the mind. From physiological evidence alone, science is aware that the mind works like the simile of the black box, which mentally brings together all types of sense data along with their mental interpretations. For example, people perceive colors in different ways. Not everybody interprets colors identically. In other words, a specific color is experienced differently from one person to the next. That innate bias is known to science. But the scientific picture is much more complicated because scientists are seeking only impersonal, objective information that can be measured and arranged into general theories. Buddhist practice, on the other hand, seeks direct insight into the nature of specific phenomena as they arise in the mind of the individual. That is, insight into how the mind itself affects the interpretation of sensory input. Since science cannot measure the interpretations that the mind places on incoming sensations, it has no means of analyzing them. But those subjective suppositions we make about sensations are crucial factors in how we perceive the world. Simply by using our basic powers of reasoning, we can go a long way toward developing a clearer understanding of how our minds work. This is possible provided we are ready to accept, or at least seriously consider, whatever conclusions our reasoning points to. If we have fixed and rigid views, opinions, or beliefs, it may be nearly impossible for us to question that world of supposition. The most effective way to analyze our situation is to start with our understanding of the external world, which we are convinced we have a firm grip on. So how do we know the world? The only means available to us is via our senses: sights, sounds, smells, tastes, and tactile sensations. This suggests where our investigation should begin. All 5 senses work in much the same way, in that they are sensitive receptors that react to stimulation caused by contact with external objects. That contact, in turn, sets up a train of electrochemical pulses that travels through the sensory nerves, terminating in the brain. This, in brief, is the regular scientific view. So, it is convenient for us to accept it as a suitable starting point. Let us analyze one sense faculty, sight, as typical of them all. Say an object, such as a tree, is seen. Light reflects off all the relevant parts of the tree, and a small part of this light enters our eyes. Due to the geometry of optics, this light forms a small image of the tree upside down on the retina, much as a camera does when taking a photo. The image selectively excites the retinal cells, which transmit nerve impulses through the optic nerve to the brain. What then happens in the brain is still poorly understood. The significant point is that from all of this, we experience the image of a tree. But where exactly does the experience of seeing a tree take place? Is the tree we perceive somewhere out there, or is it the image of the tree reflected on the retina that we see? Or is it a coded image occurring in the brain that we see? In fact, our perceptions of visual shapes, colors, and locations can be defined only in terms of the confluence of visual objects, eye contact, and eye consciousness. Therefore, the best we can say is that the tree is seen in the realm of seeing, and there's little point in asking where the realm of seeing is located. The act of seeing has three components: the visual object, the physical eye, and eye consciousness, with seeing being the coming together of the three. Those three factors do not occur consecutively, but rather they represent one visual moment, which means that all three of them operate simultaneously at the moment of sense contact. When they function in unison, visual perceptions occur. You might say that a moment of eye consciousness is like a single pixel on a computer screen, of which there must be hundreds or thousands to build up an image. That gives you an idea of how rapidly eye consciousness works. The whole process culminates in the brain, which converts nervous impulses into visual imagery, though we don't quite know how. From that process, seeing takes place. However, because seeing is an internal process based on the mind's interpretation of sense data, we never truly know the intrinsic nature of the objects we see. That internalizing principle is hard for us to grasp, because we have such a long history of considering people and things in the world to exist out there. In truth, the world we know and everything in it all arise internally. In that sense, the whole world is a mental perception. This truth becomes clearer when we realize that the external stimuli that contact the eyes are not what we actually see. For instance, the lens of the eye is sensitive to electromagnetic radiation. Although the eye picks up electromagnetic radiation, it does not transmit that radiation back to the brain. It sends a nervous current that initiates a biochemical process, which is then converted by the brain into what we interpret as light and color. From that process, visual imagery arises inside of us. Those mental images are what we see. For that reason, all seeing is composed exclusively of internal imagery. Thus, we see sights internally, not externally. In the world outside, there is actually no light and no color. There's only radiation. We refer to light and color, but those references are just analogies used to explain our experiences. In reality, light and color are both internal phenomena, not external ones. We don't actually know what's outside. All we know is what appears internally. The other senses work in much the same manner, each in its specific mode. Take hearing. The experience of sound takes place inside the mind. In the world outside, there are only vibrations of various frequencies. When those vibrations contact the ear, that stimulation excites the auditory nerves of the inner ear, which transform the stimuli into nervous impulses. Those nervous impulses are transmitted to the brain, which processes that data in some mysterious way that causes sound to arise within us. So all sound takes place inside our minds. It does not occur outside at all. What occurs out there isn't really sound. It's merely vibrations. It turns into sound only when it contacts the auditory nerve. The same principle applies to smell. Out there in nature are only chemicals, not odors. When chemicals in the air contact the nose, nervous impulses are sent to the brain. Only when the sensation gets inside of us does the experience of smell occur. So our sensory experience represents an interpretation of input from the external environment, not the external environment itself. All we know is an internalized version based on our personal viewpoint, the perspective of the knower. The knower inside can never directly contact the world outside, because contact takes place between material substances, like chemicals and bodily tissues. The internalized sensory imprint we perceive is as close as we ever get to the physical world. Our sense of taste is similar. Say you eat roast beef with chili sauce. There is no flavor in the beef or the chili. They are composed of chemicals, not flavors. When those chemicals contact your tongue, they cause a reaction. From that reaction, you experience the flavor. So, tastes arise only after the resultant chemical reactions are processed within you. You believe that the taste exists in the food, but it doesn't. The taste exists in you. The sense of touch is just physical contact caused by pressure or variations of temperature, which turns into feeling only after it is processed within us. Touch works by sending information to the spinal cord, which forwards messages to the brain, where the feeling is recognized and interpreted. But feeling is not present in the objects themselves. To summarize, we know the world we live in by means of the sense fields: seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, and touching. We then incorporate that sensory information into our perceptions, which is organized in such a way that we experience the object as external to us. In other words, we see the world as being out there in relation to us, because that's the way it appears. And we, the ones who know the world, appear to be inside and separate. But if we investigate the senses closely, we'll see that the entire world actually arises inside the mind. Although it's not difficult to understand this principle intellectually, in practical, everyday terms, I am not sure the intellectual understanding makes much difference, because most people will still act as though the world outside is something real. It appears like that to people because they instinctively think that way. But from the point of view of meditation and mental development, this knowledge is important. We learn that the way we think and the ways other people think are not the same. We interpret sense objects in our own way, but somebody else may see them in a completely different way. It's not necessarily the case that either one is wrong. Both may be right. It's just that the experiences we base our interpretations on are different. If we want to understand the senses on a deeper, more personal level, we need to carefully analyze the whole process. But keep in mind that contemplating the senses is a challenging practice. The problem is that we are strongly conditioned to see the world as existing outside ourselves and having a reality of its own. When we start investigating the senses, we can understand intellectually that the outside reality is an illusion, that actually everything is internal. However, this understanding is merely academic. Although it is quite valid on that level, we must go beyond that theoretical understanding to realize it directly for ourselves. We must realize with total certainty that the realms of the senses exist solely within our own minds. Perceiving sense objects in this way makes us aware that the outside world is not quite the place we thought it was. When that awareness strikes home, our interest in the world of the senses starts to wane. We begin to see that the world we perceive out there is merely a kind of magic show, lacking any real substance. The value of that realization is that it lessens our attachment to external things. We no longer view them as worthy of desire. Having understood with insight the true nature of sensory experience, we know that everything we perceive in the world arises internally. Because perceptions always arise inside us, they are already a part of us. So why should we want to possess them? That kind of understanding begins to break down our attachment to external objects. This insight is valuable because we see with a very clear mind what the world is. We no longer perceive sensations in the usual familiar way. Normally, we are so familiar with the world around us that we don't think much about it. Only in a moment of insight do we see it clearly and learn an important lesson. The true value lies in the lessons we learn about the world, because those lessons encourage us to let go of the world. we realize that attachment to external objects is a major cause of suffering. This detachment is the aim of the practice of wisdom. We realize the true nature of the world, mainly for the purpose of uprooting our attachment to worldly things. When we fully comprehend the nature of the world, we know, oh, it's all inside my mind. Because of that knowledge, our attachment to the world loosens its grip. When that happens, events that occur in the world don't affect us so much. Since they have less impact, we tend to shrug them off and say, that's just the way of the world. So, we let go of them. As the mind detaches from external things, the focus turns more and more inside, more toward comprehending how sense consciousness influences our perceptions of the world. Obviously, this is a complicated process. For example, consider this. Wisdom entails understanding the past and the future from the perspective of the present moment. We cannot be aware of a visual object until after the visual data have contacted the sense base. And between the moment of vision and the moment of recognition, there is a time lag. A momentary time gap exists between the arising and ceasing of one and the arising of the other. Due to that momentary delay, the past moment of vision exists only in memory. The sights, sounds, etc. that we experience have already elapsed, and our perception of them is always filtered through memory. The mind seeks images and symbols from the database of previous experience to recognize and interpret incoming sense impressions, and thus identify them. Practiced in this way, wisdom unravels the entire process of sensory experience. There is also another way to investigate this process. When we sense things, there is the one that senses and the thing that is sensed. In seeing, there is the thing that is seen and the one who sees it. From that, we get the notion that I see that. So, immediately a self, the viewer, is assumed. This self-perspective exists in relationship to all the senses in the same way, but in each case it represents a different self. The self that relates to seeing is not the same self that relates to hearing. The one that relates to the external senses is not the same one that relates to thinking or memory. Each time, it's a different self. Ultimately, when we follow the way of Dhamma to the end of all suffering, we must totally relinquish all notions of self. This dilemma of self-identity arises because we have a fixed idea of our own reality. Being attached to this fixed idea of a personal reality, we cannot see the relativity of the world. We do not understand how relative to the world around us our existence is, and how changeable. We dislike that uncertainty, so we create a self-image to act as a refuge and make that image appear very real and important. That attachment precipitates clinging to the fixed idea of self. Added to that is an unwillingness to let go, lest that self be swept away in the whirlwind of changing phenomena. But, in the final analysis, the purpose of Dhamma practice is to see all perceptions as mere phantoms, phantoms of your mind. That means that you know another person only in your mind. Therefore, that person is essentially a part of your mind. Consequently, when you're angry at that person, you're really angry at your own mind. The things that person says are heard internally. Because you hear them internally, they belong to you. The belief that they come from another person is just a delusion. The practice of Dhamma leads to the unequivocal realization that the fault lies entirely within you, that you are at fault for perceiving things wrongly. It's not that other people don't cause trouble. In the ordinary worldly sense, they do. But you are at fault when you believe that they are causing you trouble, and then reciprocate accordingly. You deserve the blame because your mind has been deceived by its interpretation of sense perceptions, deceived because it knows falsely. All we really know are sights, sounds, odors, flavors, feelings, and thoughts. When we understand this principle, we realize that what we know as sight is just a combination of form, light, and color. Sound is merely vibrations. Odors and flavors are just chemicals, and touch is only physical feeling. That's the entirety of what we experience of the external world. Those sensory experiences vary over a certain cognitive range, and that's all we can say. Our whole world is composed of that sensory input. When we know all that, we know everything. People think the universe is immeasurably large, but it isn't. In truth, it is no bigger than our sense fields. The immeasurably large universe exists within us, but most people are completely unaware of it. When you persevere in investigating everything, sooner or later you'll come back to the mind, because that's the center. You should question every sensation that arises through the eyes, ears, nose, tongue, body, and mind, and manifests as feeling, memory, thought, or consciousness. Is there anything you don't need the mind for? You need the mind for everything. Because of that, the mind is the true essential. Everything you work on in your wisdom practice will eventually come back to that one fundamental truth.